10 years ago, a young stewardess vanished during a private jet flight. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing was ever found, despite extensive searches. After a decade of grieving and clinging to the faint hope that their daughter might still be out there, her family slowly began to lose faith. But then, on one fateful day, they received an envelope containing a strange wedding invitation. What this letter revealed would turn the entire case on its head and force them to question everything they thought they knew about her disappearance. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Margaret Reynolds stood in her living room arranging framed photos of her daughter Rachel on a small table. The morning light filtered through cream-colored curtains, illuminating the young woman's smile in various stages of her life. Rachel in her high school graduation gown, Rachel on a family vacation at the beach, and in the center, Rachel in her crisp stewardess uniform for Elite Air, a private charter company catering to wealthy clients. Margaret adjusted the largest photo, taken just days before her daughter disappeared 10 years ago today. Her fingers lingered on the glass covering Rachel's face. In the photo, Rachel stood tall and proud in her Elite Air uniform, crimson red with gold buttons, her blonde hair framing her face beneath the distinctive pillbox hat, her smile confident and eager. She had been so excited about the position, calling it her foot in the door to see the world. Only 19, fresh out of hospitality school, Rachel had beaten out dozens of applicants for the coveted job, serving the ultra-wealthy on private flights. "Mom, these people go everywhere," she had said during their last phone call. "I'll get to see places I've only dreamed about." A floorboard creaked behind her, and Margaret turned to see John Reynolds entering the room carrying a vase of white lilies. He placed them on the memorial table without speaking, his weathered face set in the same stoic expression he'd maintained since their daughter vanished during a private flight for pharmaceutical billionaire William Blackwood. Margaret noticed the slight tremor in John's hands as he arranged the flowers, a silent acknowledgement of their shared grief that had become no less painful with the passing years. "They're beautiful," Margaret said softly, reaching to touch one delicate petal. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the photos. 10 years, he murmured, the words heavy with disbelief. His once dark hair had gone completely grey, his tall frame slightly stooped as though permanently bent under the weight of their loss. Margaret straightened a doily beneath the vase. She always loved lilies. They stood side by side in silence, as they'd done countless times over the past decade, neither mentioning the emptiness that had hollowed them out or the questions that still haunted their sleepless nights. What happened on that flight? How could a plane simply vanish without a trace? Why were the search efforts called off so quickly? The doorbell rang, startling them both from their thoughts. Margaret smoothed her dress, a simple blue cotton shift she'd worn for every memorial service, and moved to answer it. "I'll make sure everything's ready," John said, retreating toward the kitchen, where modest refreshments awaited their guests. Margaret opened the door to greet the small group of friends who still attended their annual memorial service. Mrs. Peterson from across the street brought homemade cookies as she always did, her plump face arranged in what Margaret had come to recognize as practiced sympathy. "These are Rachel's favorite," Mrs. Peterson said as she had every year, offering the plate of chocolate chip cookies. They both knew it was a lie. Rachel had preferred snickerdoodles, but Margaret accepted them with a grateful smile. "Thank you for coming, Edith." Rachel's former roommate Kate arrived with her husband, both offering stiff hugs that felt more obligatory than comforting. Margaret noticed how they avoided mentioning Rachel by name, instead asking about John's health and the unusually warm weather. She recognized the look in their eyes that had slowly transformed over the years, from shock to pity to something else now, something that suggested they wished the Reynolds would finally accept their daughter was gone. "We can't stay long," Kate explained as she handed Margaret a small bouquet. "Brian has a conference call at 2. Margaret nodded, understanding the subtext. Their grief had become an imposition, something to be scheduled around other, more pressing commitments. She ushered them into the living room where John had arranged folding chairs in a small semicircle facing the memorial table. 2 other couples arrived, old neighbors and a colleague of John's from before he took early retirement to focus on the search for Rachel. The gathering was noticeably smaller than last year, which had been smaller than the year before. Margaret remembered the first anniversary, when their house had overflowed with friends, family, and news reporters, still interested in the mysterious disappearance of a young stewardess serving one of America's wealthiest men. The small gathering sat in the living room as John spoke briefly about their gratitude for everyone's continued support. His voice was flat, rehearsed, having delivered some version of this speech for 10 consecutive years. Today marked a decade since Rachel disappeared while working as a stewardess on William Blackwood's private jet over the Pacific, he reminded them. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies recovered, despite extensive searches. The official investigation concluded it was a tragic accident, but John and Margaret had never accepted this explanation. There were too many unanswered questions. Margaret watched their friends shift uncomfortably in their seats, noting how the group had dwindled from nearly 30 people the first year to just 5 today. During a moment of silence, Margaret overheard Mrs. Peterson whisper to Kate, "Isn't the case completely cold by now? 10 years with nothing new. When will they finally accept it?" Kate nodded slightly in agreement, then checked her watch twice during the remainder of the short ceremony. Margaret realized that their grief had become an inconvenience to others, their refusal to accept Rachel's death, a persistent reminder of a tragedy everyone else had filed away as resolved, despite the absence of answers. She looked at the memorial table, at her daughter's smiling face, and silently renewed the promise she'd made every day for 10 years. "I will never stop looking for you." The last guest departed shortly after noon, leaving Margaret alone with the plates of barely touched refreshments. John had retreated to his workshop in the garage, where he spent most days tinkering with projects he never completed. Margaret began cleaning up, moving mechanically through the kitchen, as she had done every year after the memorial, when the doorbell rang again. She paused, wondering if Kate had returned to retrieve a forgotten item. Setting down the half-empty platter of cookies, Margaret made her way back to the front door. A courier in a brown uniform stood at the door with an electronic signature pad and a thick cream-colored envelope. "Delivery for the Reynolds residence," he said, extending the pad toward her. Margaret signed for the package and brought the envelope to the kitchen counter. It was addressed to the Richardson family at their address, an obvious mistake, but the heavy cardstock and gold embossing suggested it was a formal invitation of some kind. She sliced it open with a butter knife, preparing to write "Return to Sender" on the envelope when something caught her eye. The location printed in elegant script at the bottom of the wedding invitation, Blackwood Estate, Montana. Her hand froze mid-motion. Blackwood. The name that had haunted her thoughts for a decade. The billionaire who owned the private jet that vanished with her daughter on board. The man who claimed he wasn't on that flight that day. The same man whose legal team had blocked every attempt to pursue an independent investigation beyond what the authorities deemed sufficient. Margaret's hands began to shake as she read the invitation more carefully. William Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, cordially invited the Richardson family to the wedding of Rebecca West and William Blackwood. Margaret stared at the small photograph included of the bride-to-be, a chestnut-haired woman photographed from a distance, her features partly obscured by large sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. Despite the poor image quality, something about the woman's posture seemed hauntingly familiar. She sank into a kitchen chair, the invitation trembling in her fingers. Why would William Blackwood send a wedding invitation to their home, but addressed to the wrong name? Was it merely a clerical error, some assistant mixing up addresses on a massive guest list, or something more deliberate? The cream-colored paper felt heavy in her hands, expensive and official. Margaret remembered reading about Blackwood in business magazines. Widowed early, he had never remarried, despite being linked to various socialites over the years. Now approaching 60, he was finally taking a bride. Margaret pulled out the RSVP card and gasped when she saw a handwritten note in the margin. Something borrowed, something blue. It was a phrase from the lullaby she used to sing to her daughter Rachel every night from infancy through her teenage years, their private ritual that no one else would know. She sank into a kitchen chair, the invitation trembling in her hands, as impossible hope flooded through her for the first time in a decade. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, the air too thick to breathe properly. Margaret forced herself to inhale deeply, trying to quiet the frantic pounding of her heart. Could it be possible? After all this time? She examined the photograph again, trying to see past the sunglasses and hat, searching for any definitive feature that might confirm her suspicions. The woman in the photo stood slightly off-center, her posture suggesting reluctance rather than bridal joy. There was tension in her shoulders that reminded Margaret of how Rachel would hold herself when uncomfortable, but trying to appear poised. A memory surfaced. Rachel at 16, reluctantly posing for photos before a dance with a boy she didn't particularly like, but was too polite to reject. Margaret spread the invitation materials across the kitchen table, examining each piece for additional clues. The invitation itself was standard for high society events. Elegant typography, traditional wording. The only personalized element was the handwritten note on the RSVP card, those 4 words that had ignited hope in Margaret's heart. Something borrowed, something blue. It was their special lullaby, altered slightly from the traditional wedding rhyme. Every night, Margaret would sit on the edge of Rachel's bed and sing softly, something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and Rachel would always answer with, and a 6pence in her shoe. It became their good-night ritual, continuing long after Rachel was too old for lullabies. No one else would know this, not Blackwood, not his staff, not anyone who might be addressing wedding invitations. She glanced at the invitation date, March 23rd. Her heart skipped a beat. That was tomorrow. Margaret stood abruptly, pushing back her chair with a screech against the linoleum floor. She needed to show this to John immediately. After 10 years of false leads and crushing disappointments, she was afraid to hope, yet couldn't deny the evidence in her hands. "John!" she called, hurrying toward the garage. "John, you need to see this." John entered the kitchen after Margaret called for him repeatedly, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. His expression shifted from annoyance to concern when he saw Margaret's pale face and the document spread across the table. She explained about the invitation, pointing out the Blackwood estate location, the handwritten note, and her suspicion that Rebecca West might actually be their daughter. John's face hardened as he examined the materials, then pushed them away with visible frustration. "Margaret," he said, his voice weary with the weight of 10 years of disappointment, "you're doing it again." "Doing what?" she asked, though she already knew what he'd say. "Chasing shadows and heartbreak." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "This is probably just some marketing ploy or mix-up. Rich people send out hundreds of these invitations." "But the note, John, the lullaby." Margaret tapped the RSVP card insistently. "Something borrowed, something blue. That was our special thing with Rachel. No one else would know that." John sighed heavily. "Lots of people know that phrase. It's a common wedding saying." "Not the way we used it. Not as a lullaby every night." Margaret's voice rose with frustration. "And look at the timing. Exactly 10 years since she disappeared. That can't be coincidence." Margaret followed John as he walked back toward the garage, insisting this couldn't be coincidence. The invitation to Blackwood's wedding with the personal message only Rachel would know. John turned to face her, his voice strained as he reminded her they'd been through this before with psychics, supposed sightings, and online conspiracy theories about their daughter. "Remember that woman in Seattle?" John asked gently. "You were so sure it was Rachel. We spent our savings flying there, only to find some poor confused girl who didn't even look like our daughter." "This is different," Margaret insisted. "And the psychic in Phoenix. $5,000 for what? Some vague claims about Rachel being across water and safe but unable to communicate." John shook his head. "We can't keep doing this, Margaret. We can't keep chasing ghosts." He told her that hope was a poison they couldn't afford anymore, that Rachel was gone and this was just a cruel prank or a mistake. Margaret watched him retreat to his workshop, the door closing firmly behind him. Left alone in the kitchen, she stared at the invitation, doubt creeping in despite her initial certainty. What if John was right? What if this was another disappointment that would leave them more broken than before? But the handwritten note, the timing, the Blackwood connection, it was too specific to dismiss entirely. Margaret picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed Detective Harris, who answered on the third ring. Detective Harris had been their primary contact during the initial investigation, a middle-aged officer with perpetually tired eyes who had shown genuine concern in the beginning, but gradually distanced himself as the case grew colder. "Detective Harris, it's Margaret Reynolds." A pause. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's been a while." His tone was carefully neutral. She quickly explained about the Blackwood wedding invitation and the lullaby reference that only Rachel would know. Harris cut her off mid-sentence, his voice shifting from professional to irritated. "Margaret," he said sharply, "there was an international investigation involving multiple agencies and millions of dollars that couldn't find a single trace of that plane. And now you're telling me you have a clue based on a wedding invitation and some note with your daughter's favorite lullaby." He reminded her that grief makes people see connections that aren't there, and suggested she consider therapy again. Margaret's throat tightened as she heard him sigh heavily, before promising half-heartedly to make a note of it. "Let me be clear," he added before ending the call. "This isn't evidence of anything. William Blackwood is one of the most prominent businessmen in the country. If there was any connection between him and your daughter's disappearance, we would have found it years ago." Margaret set the phone down on the kitchen counter, her cheeks burning with humiliation from Detective Harris's dismissal. She stood for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter until her resolve hardened. Without telling John, she walked purposefully down the hallway to their small home office and sat at the desktop computer, determined to find answers on her own. The computer whirred to life, its fan humming loudly in the quiet house. Margaret opened a search engine and typed Rebecca West William Blackwood. The results were surprisingly sparse for someone engaged to a billionaire. A few mentions in society columns, 2 photographs from charity galas, but no detailed profiles or interviews. She clicked through to a business news article announcing the engagement 6 months ago. The piece read like a press release, highlighting Blackwood's pharmaceutical accomplishments, while offering almost nothing about his fiancée beyond describing her as the private and charming Rebecca West, who has been a supportive companion to the pharmaceutical giant for the past several years. Alone in their home office, Margaret searched online for information about Rebecca West and found almost nothing, unusual for a woman marrying one of America's wealthiest men. The few articles mentioning her described a private person who appeared in Blackwood's life approximately 5 years ago after being rescued from personal hardship, with no details of her background or family. In the only clear photograph available from a charity gala, Rebecca stood slightly behind Blackwood, her face partially turned away from the camera. Margaret examined this photo carefully, enlarging it to study the woman's features. Though the angle made it difficult to be certain, there was something in the shape of her jaw, the curve of her neck, that reminded Margaret of Rachel. But the chestnut brown hair threw her off. Rachel's hair had been blonde, a rich color she'd inherited from John's side of the family. Clicking through to another article, Margaret found a quote from Blackwood about his fiancée. "Rebecca came into my life when I least expected to find companionship again. Her grace and resilience captivated me from our first meeting." The phrasing struck Margaret as oddly impersonal, more like a business testimonial than a declaration of love. As she continued her research, a pattern emerged. Rebecca West seemingly appeared from nowhere 5 years ago, had no mentioned family or past career, and was described primarily in relation to Blackwood rather than as an individual. It was as though she didn't exist before meeting him. Margaret printed the clearest image she could find of Rebecca West and took it to her bedroom, pulling out a family photo album from beneath the bed. She placed the printout next to Rachel's last professional photograph, studying the faces side by side. She remembered Detective Harris's parting words before hanging up, that she was creating illusions from coincidences again, and decided against calling him or any other authorities again. Despite the different hair color and what appeared to be subtle changes to her nose and chin, Margaret saw the same eyes, the same slight asymmetry to her smile. She returned to the invitation, her mind already racing with plans to attend the wedding despite John's dismissal, determined to discover if this mystery woman was truly their long-lost daughter. She needed to act quickly. The wedding was tomorrow and Montana was hours away. Margaret began making mental lists of what she'd need: clothes, identification, directions to the Blackwood estate. She'd have to convince John to come with her, or go alone if necessary. Either way, she was going to that wedding. That night, Margaret lay awake beside John's sleeping form, rehearsing what she'd say to him in the morning. She weighed the risks of another disappointment against her need for answers. The handwritten note with their private lullaby couldn't be coincidence, yet she'd been wrong before. Detective Harris's dismissive words echoed in her mind, reminding her of past failed leads. John's breathing was deep and even beside her. His face relaxed in sleep in a way it never was during waking hours. Margaret watched him in the dim light filtering through their bedroom curtains, tracing the worry lines that had deepened over the years of searching for their daughter. She knew another disappointment might break him completely, might finally extinguish the tiny flame of hope he still carried, despite his pragmatic words. Yet if there was any chance Rebecca West was Rachel, she had to know. Margaret finally drifted off near dawn, clutching the wedding invitation against her chest, resolved to face whatever truth awaited at the Blackwood estate. At breakfast, Margaret presented her case to John, showing him the photos and invitation with the handwritten note. His initial refusal was firm but gentle. They couldn't keep chasing ghosts. But as she explained her plan to attend the wedding in Montana, something shifted in his expression. John looked up from the photos and wedding invitation, realization dawning on his face. John studied the side-by-side photos Margaret had prepared, Rachel's last professional portrait, next to the zoomed-in image of Rebecca West. "These could be different women, Margaret," he said carefully. "The facial structure is similar, but what if it is her?" Margaret interrupted. "What if our daughter has been alive all this time and needs our help?" John sighed, rubbing his temples. "Even if this Rebecca person wrote that note, which we don't know for certain, why wouldn't she have contacted us directly? Why this elaborate wedding invitation scheme?" "Maybe she couldn't," Margaret suggested, leaning forward. "Maybe she's being watched or controlled. That's why we need to go there and see for ourselves." "When is this wedding?" he asked, his voice tense. Margaret told him it was today, in just 6 hours, and they needed to hurry. There was a flight leaving in an hour, she explained, just a 2-hour journey to Montana. John stared at her, shaking his head slowly. He studied his wife's determined expression, the hope burning in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "You've already made your decision, haven't you?" he said, more a statement than a question. Margaret nodded silently, holding his gaze. John stood up and left the room without another word. Margaret's heart sank. She was prepared to go alone if necessary, but having John beside her would make this difficult journey bearable. Margaret continued gathering essentials for the trip, moving quickly through the house, afraid that every minute lost might be crucial. When she passed their bedroom, she stopped abruptly, surprised to see John pulling their larger suitcase from the closet. He glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of resignation and concern. "I can't let you do this alone," he said, folding a dress shirt carefully into the suitcase, "even if it's a wild goose chase." His voice softened as he added, "I'm with you, always have been." Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes as she watched her husband pack, grateful that after all these years of shared grief, they still faced the unknown together. She crossed the room and embraced him, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." John returned the embrace briefly before pulling away, his practical nature reasserting itself. "We should pack light. 1 small bag between us, and we should bring copies of Rachel's identification just in case." Within an hour, they'd packed a single suitcase with essentials, withdrawn cash from their modest savings account, and called for a taxi to take them to the airport. The drive to the airport passed in a blur of traffic and tense silence. Security lines, boarding announcements, and the takeoff all blended together as Margaret sat rigid in her seat, clutching her purse where she'd stored the wedding invitation. John dozed fitfully beside her, while she stared out the small oval window at clouds that seemed to form and dissolve like the doubts in her mind. What if this is another mistake, she thought, remembering the psychic in Arizona who took their money, the supposed sighting in Vancouver that led nowhere, the internet theories that consumed months of their lives. She was chasing shadows again, she knew, but couldn't stop herself. 10 years without answers, 10 years of imagining her daughter's final moments alone in the vast Pacific. She needed to know, even if it meant confronting William Blackwood, the billionaire who employed Rachel, whose plane carried her into oblivion, and who had never once reached out to them in all these years. 2 hours later, they landed in Helena, Montana. The terminal was small compared to what they were used to, with mounted animal heads decorating the walls and advertisements for local wilderness tours. They navigated quickly to the rental car counter, where John presented his driver's license and credit card. Margaret watched John at the rental car counter, filling out paperwork with meticulous care as he always did. His shoulders looked more stooped than she remembered, his hair grayer, evidence of how their shared tragedy had weathered him. She felt a pang of guilt for dragging him into another potentially heartbreaking situation, but the pull of possibility was too strong to resist. They found a budget motel just 30 minutes from the Blackwood estate, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and faded bedspreads. "We need somewhere to change," Margaret explained to the clerk, who handed them a key attached to a plastic number tag without interest. Their financial situation wasn't what it once was. The private investigators, the lawyers challenging the official reports, the trips following leads, all had drained their retirement savings to a trickle. In the cramped motel bathroom, Margaret unpacked her navy blue dress, saved for special occasions, while John carefully laid out his best Sunday coat, now slightly shiny at the elbows. Looking at their reflection in the spotted mirror, Margaret wondered if they'd even be allowed past the front gates of the Blackwood estate in their modest attire, but pushed the thought aside. The clothes didn't matter, only finding the truth did. "What time should we leave?" John asked, checking his watch. It was already 3:30 p.m. The invitation indicated the ceremony began at 5 p.m., with the reception to follow. John voiced his concerns about security, expecting the extensive measures a billionaire would implement for such a private event. Margaret reached into her purse and produced printouts of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals Charity Foundation, explaining that if questioned, they'd claim to be representatives of a medical charity hoping to arrange a meeting with Blackwood. John looked at her with surprise at this level of preparation. A glimpse of the determined woman who existed before grief hollowed her out over the past decade. "You've thought of everything," he said quietly. Margaret zipped her dress and adjusted the simple strand of pearls at her neck, a wedding gift from John 27 years ago. "We should leave in 20 minutes, she said. "That will get us there early enough to observe, but not so early we stand out." John nodded, buttoning his shirt. "And if we see her, if it really is Rachel, what then?" Margaret paused, meeting his eyes in the mirror. It was the question she'd been avoiding since receiving the invitation. "Then we bring our daughter home," she said, with more confidence than she felt. The drive to the Blackwood estate revealed an unexpected complication. As they approached the compound, they passed several luxury vehicles being turned away at a checkpoint a mile before the main gate. Margaret watched anxiously as a security team checked each vehicle against tablets, directing those without proper credentials to a parking area where shuttle buses waited. John slowed their rental car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as they overheard security telling a well-dressed couple that invitation verification was mandatory and no exceptions could be made. Margaret quickly pulled out their forged invitation, examining it with fresh worry. Would it pass whatever electronic verification system Blackwood had implemented? "This doesn't look good," John muttered, nodding toward the checkpoint where men in dark suits with earpieces scanned QR codes on invitations. "They're running some kind of verification." "We have the invitation," Margaret reminded him, though her confidence was wavering. "The QR code should work." "And if they ask for ID, we're supposed to be the Richardsons, remember?" Margaret bit her lip, watching as another car was directed to the shuttle area. Let's see how thorough they're being first. John suggested turning back, finding another way, but Margaret reminded him this was their only chance to confirm if Rebecca was truly their daughter. They exchanged a tense look as they joined the line of vehicles, their simple plan suddenly feeling dangerously inadequate against Blackwood's extensive security measures. If we get turned away, we'll try the service entrance, Margaret decided, or find another way in through the grounds. John glanced at her with surprise. Breaking and entering wasn't part of the plan. Neither was giving up, she countered. As their rented Ford approached the checkpoint, Margaret straightened her dress and adopted a confident expression. "Follow my lead," she instructed John quietly. "Act like we belong here." The Blackwood estate loomed ahead as their rental car approached the main gate, a massive stone structure with uniformed security guards checking each arriving vehicle. Towering pine trees lined the long driveway beyond, obscuring the main house from view. Margaret felt her heart pounding as they joined the line of luxury cars waiting for inspection. John reached over to squeeze her hand, a rare gesture of solidarity as they prepared to present their invitation and rehearsed story. When they reached the checkpoint, a guard in a tailored black suit approached the driver's side window. "Invitation, please," he requested, his manner professional but curt. Margaret handed over the cream-colored envelope, smiling pleasantly. "We're the Richardsons," she said. "James and Elizabeth." The security guard at the checkpoint examined their invitation with a handheld scanner, confirming it was authentic, while another guard circled their vehicle with what appeared to be a detection wand. Margaret maintained a pleasant smile despite her nerves, explaining they were the Richardsons, distant connections through pharmaceutical industry conferences. The guard studied his tablet screen, frowning slightly. "I don't see a vehicle registration for you." "Oh, we flew in this morning," Margaret explained smoothly. "This is a rental car." The guard nodded but continued examining his tablet with a deepening frown. "One moment, please." He stepped away from the vehicle to confer with another security officer. John shot Margaret a worried glance. "They're not buying it," he whispered. "Just stay calm," she whispered back, maintaining her pleasant expression. The guard returned to their window. "Your names aren't showing up in our verified guest database." Margaret feigned confusion. "That's strange. We received the invitation weeks ago." She gestured to the envelope. "As you can see, it's authentic." The guard consulted his tablet, frowned slightly, then looked at them again before ultimately waving them through. "Parking is to the left of the main house. Follow the signs to guest seating." John released a tense breath as they drove up the winding road toward the main estate, both shocked their simple plan had worked so far. "I can't believe that worked," he muttered, as they followed the curve of the private drive. "The invitation was real," Margaret reminded him. "Someone wanted us here." The Blackwood estate gradually revealed itself as they ascended the winding road, a sprawling mansion of grey stone and glass that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself. Pristine gardens surrounded the property, and a helicopter pad sat visible on one wing of the massive structure. The scale of wealth on display was staggering. They pulled into the designated parking area, where attendants in formal uniforms directed vehicles into neat rows. Luxury cars dominated, Bentleys, Maseratis, and sleek SUVs with diplomatic plates. Their modest rental car stood out conspicuously among the opulence. Margaret and John entered the lavish ceremony space, set up on the estate's vast lawn. White chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an elaborate floral arch where a string quartet played softly. Guests in expensive attire mingled, while uniformed staff circulated with champagne. "Don't accept any drinks," John murmured close to Margaret's ear. "We need to stay clear-headed." Margaret nodded, scanning the crowd for any sign of the bride, noting the heavy security presence positioned discreetly around the perimeter. John guided her to seats near the back, where they'd have a clear view while remaining relatively inconspicuous among the hundreds of guests who appeared to be primarily business associates rather than friends or family. The ceremony space filled quickly as more guests arrived. Margaret studied the attendees, noticing how they clustered in small groups, speaking in low tones. These weren't close friends celebrating a joyous occasion, but business associates and social climbers navigating a networking opportunity. "Look there," John whispered, nodding toward a roped-off section of seats near the front. "Government officials, I think. I recognize the Secretary of Commerce." Margaret's attention was drawn to movement near the main house as staff began ushering the final guests to their seats. A string quartet transitioned to traditional wedding music, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. The ceremony began with the traditional processional music as William Blackwood took his position at the altar. At 58, he cut an imposing figure in his tailored tuxedo, tall, fit, with silver hair and the confident posture of a man accustomed to power. Margaret studied his face, searching for any sign of the monster she believed him to be, but saw only the practiced smile of a public figure. Blackwood stood with perfect posture, hands clasped before him, projecting the image of a distinguished groom awaiting his bride. But Margaret noticed something in his eyes as he surveyed the gathered crowd. Not the nervous anticipation of a man about to wed, but the calculating assessment of a businessman monitoring an investment. The music swelled, and the guests rose as the bridal processional began. Margaret gripped John's arm so tightly he winced, her eyes fixed on the path from the main house where the bride would appear. Then the bride appeared at the far end of the aisle, and Margaret clutched John's arm so tightly he winced. Despite the elegant updo and sophisticated makeup that transformed her appearance, Margaret immediately recognized the way she moved, the slight tilt of her head. It was Rachel. "John," she whispered urgently, "it's her, it's Rachel." John squinted, trying to see past the elegant white gown and carefully applied makeup. The bride walked slowly down the aisle, a practiced smile fixed on her face that didn't reach her eyes. As she passed their row, Margaret got a clearer view of her profile and her certainty solidified. Despite the different hair and subtle alterations to her features, Margaret would know her daughter anywhere. "My God," John breathed, his voice barely audible. "It could be her." They watched in stunned silence as the bride took her place beside Blackwood at the altar. The officiant began the ceremony with practiced eloquence, but Margaret barely heard the words. Her mind raced with questions and possibilities. If that woman was truly Rachel, what had happened to her over the past 10 years? How did she become Blackwood's bride? And most importantly, was she there of her own free will? The reception unfolded in a massive tent adorned with thousands of white orchids and crystal chandeliers. Margaret and John strategically positioned themselves near the entrance to the tent, watching as the newly married couple greeted their guests in a receiving line. Up close, Margaret catalogued the changes in her daughter's appearance, the now darker hair, the slightly altered nose, the thinner face. But underneath these modifications, she was certain this was Rachel. John remained skeptical, whispering that Margaret was seeing what she wanted to see, but even he fell silent when they noticed Rebecca wearing a distinctive pearl bracelet partially hidden under her sleeve, the same one Rachel's grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. "That's her grandmother's bracelet," Margaret whispered, "the one with the tiny sapphire clasp. Rachel never took it off." John stared at the delicate strand of pearls, visible only when the bride lifted her hand to accept congratulations. "It could be similar," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's identical," Margaret insisted. "And look at how she holds her champagne glass, 3 fingers just like Rachel always did. It's her mannerisms, John. You can change someone's appearance, but not the little habits they've had their whole life." The receiving line moved slowly, as hundreds of guests offered congratulations to the newlyweds. Margaret observed how Blackwood kept a possessive hand at the small of his bride's back, how he intercepted and answered questions directed at her, maintaining control of each interaction. Rebecca smiled and nodded appropriately, but her eyes constantly scanned the room, alert and watchful in a way that seemed at odds with a joyful bride. Margaret and John slowly made their way through the reception, careful not to draw attention as they edged closer to the bride. Margaret smoothed her navy blue dress, the nicest one she owned, but still noticeably simpler than the designer gowns surrounding them. John tugged at his slightly dated Sunday coat, its subtle shine at the elbows betraying years of careful maintenance. "We stand out," John muttered, noticing the curious glances from other guests. "Everyone here looks like they stepped off a magazine cover." "It doesn't matter," Margaret replied, her eyes fixed on Rachel. "We just need to get close enough to speak with her." They watched as Blackwood was momentarily pulled away by a group of men in expensive suits, business associates demanding his attention. Rebecca remained in the receiving line, continuing to greet guests with practiced poise, though Margaret noticed her smile became more genuine when Blackwood stepped away. "This is our chance," Margaret said. "We need to get in that line now while he's distracted." When they finally maneuvered into the receiving line, Margaret rehearsed what to say, prepared for any reaction. As they approached, Rebecca smiled politely at first, then froze when she recognized them. The champagne glass in her hand slipped, shattering on the marble floor. In that unguarded moment, Margaret saw pure shock and recognition in her eyes. Time seemed to suspend as mother and daughter locked gazes across the short distance between them. In Rebecca's eyes, Margaret saw a flicker of the girl she raised, a momentary crack in whatever facade she'd been maintaining. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned as Rebecca composed herself. "I'm so sorry about that," Rebecca said smoothly, gesturing to a nearby server who rushed forward with a towel. Her voice was different, slightly lower, with a hint of an accent that wasn't there before. But the cadence, the way she formed certain words, was unmistakably Rachel's. "Clumsy me," she continued with a practiced laugh, avoiding direct eye contact with either Margaret or John. "Thank you for coming. Are you friends of William's?" Before Margaret could respond, Blackwood returned to his bride's side, immediately placing a proprietary hand on her waist. "What happened here?" he asked, noticing the broken glass being cleaned up. "Just an accident," Rebecca answered quickly. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Margaret and John, lingering on Margaret's simple dress and John's worn suit cuffs. His expression hardened as he registered these strangers, who clearly didn't belong among his carefully curated guest list of political allies and business elites. Where other men wore custom Italian suits and women displayed the latest couture, the Reynolds stood out conspicuously in their modest attire. He signaled subtly to his head of security, who stood nearby, monitoring the reception. "May I see your invitation?" the security head asked with practiced politeness as he approached. "We're doing random verification checks." Margaret retrieved the invitation from her purse, maintaining a composed expression despite her racing heart. The security officer examined it with a handheld scanner, then looked up with a hardened expression. "Please come with me," he said quietly. One guard gripped Margaret's elbow firmly, while another positioned himself to block John from moving forward, maintaining the appearance of discretion while effectively isolating them from the other guests. Margaret caught a last glimpse of Rachel's face, a flash of fear quickly masked by the practiced neutral expression of Rebecca West, before they were escorted away. The security team swiftly escorted them through a service corridor, away from the celebration, ignoring Margaret's protests and John's demands for explanation. They were guided into what appeared to be a lavish guest room with a four-poster bed and silk draperies. But the click of the lock engaging behind them confirmed the elegant room's true purpose, a beautifully appointed cell in Blackwood's mansion. "This is outrageous," John said as soon as the door closed. "They can't just detain us like this." Margaret moved immediately to the door, trying the handle and finding it locked as expected. "It's her, John," she said, turning to face her husband. "You saw her reaction when she recognized us. That's our daughter." John sank onto an ornate chair, running a hand over his face. "Even if it is Rachel, and I'm not saying it is, what do we do now? We're locked in a room in a billionaire's compound with no way to contact anyone." Margaret surveyed the room, noting the absence of a telephone and the heavy curtains covering what appeared to be barred windows. "We wait," she said finally. "Rachel knows we're here now, that's what matters." They waited in the room for hours, without any idea of what was happening outside. After a while, it was time for sleep. Neither Margaret nor John could sleep, both lying awake in the darkness of their luxurious prison, replaying the day's events in their minds. The bedside clock read 2:58 a.m. when a soft knock broke the silence. John rose immediately and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, Rebecca stood in the hallway wearing a simple black outfit, her wedding finery replaced by practical clothes. She slipped inside quickly, closing the door silently behind her. She pressed a finger to her lips before either parent could speak. "I don't have much time," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the door. Gone was the poised socialite from the wedding. In her place stood a woman clearly terrified but determined. Margaret stepped forward, unable to contain herself. "Rachel, is it really you?" The woman nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Mum," she whispered, the word breaking on a sob. After years as Blackwood's captive, she explained in a whisper, she'd learned to navigate his security measures and found a brief window when she could visit undetected. Her eyes darted to her watch. She had less than 15 minutes before she must return or her absence would be noticed, potentially putting them all in danger. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the daughter they thought dead and the parents who never stopped grieving, separated by 10 years of unimaginable circumstances. Then Rachel stepped forward, collapsing into her father's arms first, seeking the protection and safety she'd been denied for so long, before turning to her mother's embrace for the warmth and comfort only she could provide. The three clung to each other in silence, their bodies shaking with suppressed emotion, a family fractured by tragedy, now briefly reunited in a stolen moment. "I never thought I'd see you again," Rachel whispered, pulling back to look at her parents' faces. "How did you find me?" "The invitation," Margaret explained. "The note about something borrowed, something blue." "Our lullaby." Rachel nodded, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "I had to take a chance. I knew Blackwood's staff wouldn't notice the change to one invitation out of hundreds." "What happened?" John asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "They told us your plane crashed in the Pacific." Rachel spoke in hushed tones, confirming what Margaret already knew in her heart. She explained she'd been held against her will since the day she disappeared, when Blackwood drugged her after she rejected his advances during the flight. The plane diverted to his private airstrip in Montana instead of continuing to its destination. "We were supposed to fly to Tokyo," Rachel explained, her voice barely audible. "Just Blackwood, myself, the pilot, and Melissa, the other flight attendant. About 2 hours in, Blackwood started making advances. When I refused him, he became angry." She paused, swallowing hard. "He had the pilot change course while I was in the galley. When I realized we were descending too soon, I confronted him. That's when he—" She faltered, closing her eyes briefly. "He drugged me, put something in a drink he insisted I take." Her colleague Melissa, who witnessed everything, attempted to call for help and was killed, as Rachel watched, her body disposed of over the ocean to support the crash narrative. Rachel recounted how she became Blackwood's prisoner, eventually complying with his demands to avoid Melissa's fate, undergoing subtle cosmetic procedures and adopting a new identity as Rebecca West with a fabricated backstory. "He had a compound prepared," she continued. "This place, but an older section that's been renovated since. I was kept locked in a suite of rooms for months. He told me that if I tried to escape, he'd hurt you both. He showed me surveillance photos of you at home, at the grocery store, at Dad's work. He knew everything about our lives." John sat frozen in shock as Rachel described the psychological tactics Blackwood employed. Isolation, intermittent kindness, constant monitoring, and threats against her family if she attempted to escape or reveal her identity. She explained that over years of captivity, she earned small amounts of freedom by playing the role of willing companion, allowing her to gradually gather evidence of Blackwood's crimes. "I had to become Rebecca," she explained, her voice hollow. "I had to make him believe I was grateful to him, that I'd accepted my new life. It was the only way to survive." She told them that Blackwood recorded everything, maintaining files that implicated powerful people in his network, including law enforcement officials who helped cover up her disappearance. These connections made her afraid to attempt escape, knowing that even if she got away, she and her family would never be safe. "The pilot who diverted the plane is now Blackwood's head of transportation," Rachel explained. "The doctor who altered my appearance is on his payroll. The detective who led the official investigation into the crash received a 7-figure donation to his private foundation. Blackwood has connections everywhere. Police, FBI, even judges. That's why I couldn't just run away. There's nowhere we could hide that his network couldn't find us." "But why the wedding?" John asked. "Why would he marry you if he had to keep you prisoner?" "Control," Rachel said simply. "As his girlfriend, I was just a woman who could leave. As his wife, I become his property in the eyes of his social circle, and he needed a wife for appearances as he moves into politics. He's planning to run for Senate next year." Rachel explained how she engineered their presence at the wedding, revealing that her position as Blackwood's fiancée finally granted her access to wedding preparations, including the guest list. She managed to alter one invitation during production, changing the delivery address and adding the lullaby note only her mother would recognize. "This is the break I've been hoping for since I got here," she continued. "As his fiancée, I finally gained enough trust to access certain areas without constant supervision. When I saw the wedding invitations being prepared, I knew this might be my only opportunity." She slipped it into the outgoing mail, knowing this might be her only chance to reach out before Blackwood moves her to his compound in the Cayman Islands after the wedding, a location where she would be even more isolated and controlled. "We leave tomorrow afternoon," she said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Once we're on his private island, I'll have no chance of ever escaping. The security there is impenetrable." Rachel not only explained her situation, but also slipped a small flash drive into her mother's hand. Margaret felt the weight of it against her palm, understanding immediately its significance. Rachel's eyes locked with hers, conveying the importance without words. "Everything's on here," Rachel whispered urgently. "Financial records, recordings of his confessions, documentation of what happened to Melissa and me. I've been gathering evidence for years, waiting for a chance like this." Margaret clutched the flash drive tightly, this small piece of plastic suddenly the most precious object she'd ever held. John moved closer, placing his hand protectively over his wife's, covering the flash drive from view. "I had to be careful," Rachel continued. "He monitors everything, emails, phone calls, even conversations in most rooms of the house. But over time, I found ways around his surveillance. Small blind spots in the system where I could hide things, record conversations when he thought he was safe." Rachel gave them Michael Corrigan's contact information at the Washington Post. "He's been investigating Blackwood for pharmaceutical fraud," she explained. "This will give him everything he needs to bring Blackwood down." John committed the name and number to memory as Rachel continued, explaining how Corrigan had been researching Blackwood's company for years, but always lacking the insider evidence to make the charges stick. "Blackwood's company has been falsifying drug trial results," she explained. "People have died from medications that were rushed through approval. Corrigan's been trying to prove it for years, but Blackwood's too careful with the paper trail." Rachel warned them not to contact local authorities as she checked her watch again. "Blackwood has too many connections here," she told them. "Find Corrigan. He has federal contacts who aren't in Blackwood's pocket." She moved toward the door, pausing to embrace each parent once more. "I have to go back now," she said, her voice breaking. "If he realizes I'm missing—" "We can't leave you here," John protested, grasping her hand. "Come with us now. We'll find a way out." Rachel shook her head. "He has armed guards at every exit, and if I disappear tonight, he'll know you have the evidence, and he'll destroy everything before you can get to Corrigan. This is the only way." As she slipped out the door, Margaret noticed that her daughter moved with the hyper-vigilant precision of someone who has survived by memorizing every blind spot in the surveillance system, skills no one should have to develop. "I love you both," Rachel whispered, her hand on the doorknob. "Don't try to contact me again until it's safe. When Blackwood is arrested, then you can come for me." With those words, she disappeared into the darkened hallway, leaving Margaret and John alone with the precious flash drive and the knowledge that their daughter was alive, but still in terrible danger. Margaret and John woke early the next morning to a firm knock on their door. 2 security guards in dark suits informed them that Mr. Blackwood had arranged for their immediate departure. "There will be no further interaction with the family," one guard stated flatly. "We've been instructed to escort you directly to your vehicle." Margaret noticed how they stood with hands positioned near concealed weapons, making it clear this wasn't a request, but an order. She exchanged a glance with John, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Don't resist, just comply." "We'll need a few minutes to gather our things," John said calmly. They were given 15 minutes to gather their belongings, the guards waiting just outside the door. John moved efficiently around the room, packing their overnight bag, while Margaret secured the flash drive in the inner pocket of her jacket. Neither spoke, communicating only through meaningful glances and practiced movements developed over decades of marriage. The flash drive rested safely against Margaret's side, containing both the evidence of Blackwood's crimes and the key to Rachel's freedom. As John zipped the small suitcase, he leaned close to Margaret, using the sound of the zipper to mask his whispered words. "Check for tails when we leave. He might have us followed." Margaret nodded slightly, slipping into her jacket and patting the pocket containing the flash drive to ensure it was secure. Her mind raced with contingency plans. If they were followed, they'd need to lose their pursuers before contacting Corrigan. If Blackwood's influence extended to the local police, they couldn't risk being stopped on their way to the airport. The security team escorted them through a service corridor rather than the main hallway, clearly intended to prevent them from encountering any wedding guests, or, more importantly, Rachel. Margaret scanned each corner and doorway as they moved through the mansion, memorizing the layout, searching for any glimpse of her daughter. The estate felt different in the morning light, less like a luxury retreat, and more like the prison it truly was, at least for Rachel. They were led through a kitchen area where staff prepared breakfast, then out a service entrance where their rental car had been brought around. Margaret noted with concern that it wasn't where they had parked it the previous day. Someone had moved it, perhaps searched it. John seemed to realize this too, his posture stiffening slightly as he took the keys from the valet. "Mr. Blackwood wishes you a safe journey home," one of the guards said with manufactured politeness, "and he requests that you do not attempt to contact the family again." The threat underlying these polite words hung in the air between them. Margaret simply nodded, climbing into the passenger seat while John took the driver's side. As they passed through the estate's main gate, Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. Blackwood himself had apparently not recognized them. His security team seemed to think they were merely uninvited guests, rather than parents of his captive bride. It was a small mercy in their desperate situation. Margaret turned for one last look at the sprawling mansion, where her daughter remained captive. She made a solemn promise in her mind. "I will bring you home, Rachel." After 10 years of helplessness, she finally had purpose and direction. John reached for her hand across the center console, his grip firm and supportive. Margaret clutched the hidden flash drive with her other hand and whispered, "We're coming back for you, this time with the full force of justice." Even as their car wound down the mountain road, putting physical distance between them and Rachel, Margaret felt closer to her daughter than she had in a decade, connected by the evidence they carried and the promise of reunion. They contacted Corrigan immediately after getting out of Blackwood's mansion. The journalist agreed to meet them at a coffee shop in Bozeman, arriving with a worn leather briefcase and the cautious demeanor of someone accustomed to meeting nervous sources. Margaret slid the flash drive across the table without preamble, explaining in hushed tones what Rachel told them. Corrigan's expression shifted from professional interest to stunned disbelief as he realized the implications. "This is the evidence I've been searching for years," he murmured, examining the flash drive. "If what you're saying is true, that Blackwood abducted your daughter and has been keeping her prisoner all this time, this is bigger than the pharmaceutical fraud I've been investigating." "It's all connected," Margaret explained, leaning forward. "Rachel said the fraud investigation could be the key to exposing everything else. The evidence on that drive proves both." Corrigan tucked the flash drive securely into an inner pocket of his jacket. "I'll need to verify everything, of course, but if this contains what you say it does, we're talking about crimes that could put Blackwood away for life. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, possibly murder if we can prove what happened to the other flight attendant." He noticed the parents' expressions tighten with worry, a flash of something beyond their initial relief. When he paused, Margaret told him that his daughter had been his prisoner for 10 years. "This, with all the bureaucracy, will take months until she is freed," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "My daughter is still in that monster's house," she continued, her voice breaking. "Every minute she remains there, she's in danger. If he suspects she helped us—" Corrigan shook his head, leaning forward with unexpected intensity. He told them that FBI had already been investigating Blackwood, and they just needed damning evidence. And they had it now. It would not be months, but mere days, he assured them. "I've been working with an FBI task force on the pharmaceutical fraud case for over a year," he explained. "They've been building a RICO case against Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, but they needed concrete evidence tying Blackwood himself to the fraud. If this flash drive contains what you say it does, they can move immediately." The hope reignited in Margaret and John's eyes as Corrigan explained that he'd worked with a specialized FBI unit before and had contacts he trusted implicitly. "Give me 2 hours to review what's on this drive and contact my FBI connection. Meet me at my office at the Post's local bureau." True to what Corrigan said, a few hours later they secured emergency warrants for Blackwood's arrest and a search of his properties. Margaret watched in the FBI field office as agents reviewed the evidence from Rachel's flash drive, their professional demeanor slipping as they examined recordings of Blackwood discussing the disposal of the flight attendant Melissa and financial transfers to officials who helped cover up the disappearance. "This recording alone is enough for an arrest warrant," the lead agent explained, removing his headphones after listening to Blackwood's casual discussion of bribing officials to classify the private jet as crashed. "But combined with the financial records, emails, and the pharmaceutical trial falsification evidence, we're looking at multiple federal charges." The lead agent explained they'd been building a case against Blackwood for years, but could never get concrete evidence. Rachel's documentation provided the missing pieces they needed. "Your daughter was incredibly brave and methodical," he told Margaret and John. "These recordings were clearly made at great personal risk. The technical way she documented everything, timestamps, corroborating evidence, cross-referencing, it's better than most of our own agents could do under those circumstances." A detailed operation plan came together with remarkable speed. The FBI, working with trusted elements of local law enforcement not connected to Blackwood, designed a raid on the estate timed to coincide with the couple's departure for the Cayman Islands. 3 separate teams would secure the mansion, the airstrip where Blackwood's private jet awaited, and the convoy route between them. "We'll need you to stay here," the agent in charge told Margaret and John. "It's too dangerous to have civilians present during the operation." "Our daughter is in that house," John argued. "We need to be there when you find her." After some discussion, a compromise was reached. The Reynolds would be allowed to wait in a vehicle with agents near the perimeter of the estate, out of danger, but close enough to be reunited with Rachel as soon as she was safely extracted. The FBI operation unfolded with military precision. Margaret and John waited in an unmarked vehicle, with 2 agents near the estate's perimeter, listening to tactical radio communications as the raid commenced. Officers in tactical gear secured the mansion's entrances and grounds simultaneously, while another team intercepted Blackwood's private jet at the nearby airstrip as he attempted to flee with Rachel. "Alpha team in position at north entrance," crackled one voice over the radio. "Bravo securing the perimeter. No hostiles encountered," responded another. "Target vehicle approaching airstrip. Prepare to intercept." Margaret clutched John's hand as they heard the agents coordinating their movements, each update bringing them closer to either reunion or heartbreak. The minutes stretched endlessly as they waited for confirmation. "Subject Blackwood in custody," announced a terse voice eventually. "Resistance encountered. Situation contained." Margaret held her breath, waiting for news of Rachel. The silence over the radio seemed to last forever before they heard the words they'd been praying for. "Target secured. Female subject recovered safely." Margaret clutched John's hand as they heard the confirmation. "Target secured. Female subject recovered safely." Pure relief washed over them, tears streaming down Margaret's face. John pulled her close, his own eyes damp as they waited for their daughter to be brought to them. When the agents escorted Rachel to their vehicle, she was wrapped in a shock blanket, but walking under her own power. Her face, now free from the makeup and styling that transformed her into Rebecca West, finally showed the daughter they'd been searching for all these years. The reunion happened in slow motion for Margaret, the car door opening, Rachel appearing in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes clear and focused. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, as if neither could believe this moment was real after so many years of separation and despair. The three collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing freely. Rachel because she was finally free, Margaret and John because their decade of searching had ended with their daughter alive and back in their embrace. Unlike their tense midnight meeting, this reunion carried no fear, no countdown, no danger, only the overwhelming relief of a family made whole again. "It's over," Rachel whispered, her voice muffled against her father's shoulder. "He can't hurt us anymore." Margaret cradled her daughter's face between her hands, studying the features that had changed and those that remained the same. "You're coming home," she said, the simple words carrying the weight of 10 years of prayers. 1 year later, the Reynolds home buzzed with activity as guests arrived for what Margaret called their homecoming anniversary. The living room where they once held somber memorials now overflowed with flowers and laughter. The small table that once displayed Rachel's photographs had been replaced by a larger one holding a cake decorated with the words, "Welcome Home." The house had been transformed, just as their lives had been. Where heavy curtains once hung, letting in only slivers of light, bright windows now welcomed sunshine. New paint covered the walls, warm yellows and soft blues, chosen by Rachel herself during her ongoing recovery. Photos still lined the mantel, showing recent moments, Rachel with her therapist receiving an award for courage, the three Reynolds at the courthouse after Blackwood's conviction. John greeted guests at the door, his demeanor transformed from the stoic, withdrawn man of a year ago. The past year had softened the hard edges of grief that once defined him. His hair was trimmed, his clothes new, his posture straight again as he welcomed each arrival with genuine warmth. Mrs. Peterson from across the street brought homemade cookies, but this time they were snickerdoodles, Rachel's true favorite. Margaret watched as Mrs. Peterson embraced Rachel with genuine affection, no longer the awkward sympathy of memorial services past. Rachel stood beside her, helping arrange them on a platter. Though still thin, Rachel had regained some of the softness she lost during captivity. Her hair had grown out, returning to its natural blonde color, and she'd stopped wearing the heavy makeup that was part of her Rebecca persona. Kate, Rachel's former roommate, no longer checked her watch or offered stiff hugs. She sat comfortably on the sofa, listening intently to Rachel's carefully worded account of her ongoing therapy. "The exposure therapy has been the hardest," Rachel explained, "but my therapist says I'm making remarkable progress." Michael Corrigan arrived with his wife, bringing news about Blackwood's case. The appeals court denied his latest motion, Corrigan told them, and 3 more executives from Blackwood Pharmaceuticals accepted plea deals this morning. The case against William Blackwood expanded far beyond what even Rachel had documented. Federal investigators uncovered decades of crimes, pharmaceutical fraud that led to patient deaths, bribery of officials, tax evasion, and evidence suggesting Rachel wasn't his first victim. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Rachel interact with the guests who once attended her memorial services. Recovery hadn't been straightforward. Rachel spent the first few months after her rescue in a specialized treatment facility. Her return home brought new challenges: nightmares, panic attacks, the difficulty of re-establishing her legal identity after being declared dead. She noticed how Rachel still tensed when someone approached from behind, how certain phrases caused her to fall momentarily silent. But she also saw her daughter's growing strength, the quiet determination of a survivor who had reclaimed her name and her story. The pearl bracelet from her grandmother, hidden all those years as her small act of rebellion, now rested permanently on her wrist. John joined Margaret in the doorway. "She's doing better today," he observed quietly, "more like herself." Margaret nodded. "The good days are outnumbering the bad ones now." Rachel turned and caught her mother watching, offering a smile that still held shadows of her ordeal, but now contained something else too. Not just survival, but the promise of renewal. Rachel raised her glass in a silent toast to her mother, the gesture mirroring how 10 years ago Margaret had arranged photographs of a daughter she refused to believe was gone. "To coming home," Margaret whispered, raising her own glass in response, "and to moving forward together,